This evening, we are marking the 20th year of this series, which began in the spring of 1990. It seems today there are few things that continue over such an extended period of time, and even fewer that continue and that are able to retain not only their focus, but their quality. Concordia is indeed proud that this is one event that has stood the test of time. The Global Speaker Series, renamed as the Jacobson Global Lecture Series in 2004, in honor of David Jacobson, the college's provost, who passed away that year, has a rich history of distinguished speakers. Your program includes the list of previous speakers whose topics have spanned the globe and touched on a broad range of issues, from human rights, economics, foreign policy, politics, terrorism, war, and poverty, to name a few. It is good to continue this series with yet another distinguished speaker and topic. Before we continue, I would like to take this opportunity to welcome and to introduce Ms. Kate Coors Jacobson, David's widow, who is with us this evening. Kate, would you stand? And now I'd like to ask Dr. Mandana Nakai, our Dean of Faculty, to come forward and introduce our speaker.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Jacobson Global Lecture Series. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to thank Emma Oxford, Director of Community Relations, for planning and organizing this event. Thank you. We are privileged to have with us Bobby Ghosh, Senior Editor and columnist at Time magazine. Prior to his current position, he was the magazine's bureau chief in Baghdad and the longest-serving print journalist during the war in Iraq. Bobby Ghosh has been with Time magazine since 1998, with assignments including Hong Kong and London. His journalism includes other volatile areas in the Middle East, such as Kashmir and Palestine. His insightful articles cover a range of topics, from suicide bombers and terrorists to political figures. More recently, he visited Haiti, covering the aftermath of Haiti's devastating earthquake. Most of us remember him from his riveting 2006 cover story in Time magazine, Life in Hell, a Baghdad diary. From his harrowing flight into Baghdad airport to the ghastly images of death and destruction that permeate the daily lives of innocent civilians, Bobby Ghosh vividly described what it was like to live in a state of terror and constant fear. When asked about the risks and rigors of combat reporting, he had said, and I quote, "You set aside personal anxiety and don't allow yourself to acknowledge the perils." In this spirit, during the chaos in Iraq, he and his lovely wife, B. Pasha, who was working in Singapore at the time, would have virtual dinners together in front of the computer. What a way to endure in a war-torn country. It is indeed a pleasure to introduce to you Bobby Ghosh.
Thank you very much for a very, very kind introduction. Thank you for having me back here. It's an honor to be asked to speak, to give the Jacobson Global Lecture. It's an honor that I'm not entirely sure I deserve, but I will do my best to live up to. I wish I could set aside my personal anxiety right now, because as if it isn't hard enough to speak to an August gathering like this, I made the mistake of actually reading the names of people who've spoken here before, and I realized that I am punching way above my weight class tonight. The subject is the lessons we've learned and are still learning from the two wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. But before we get there, I wanted to start by giving you some sense of where we started before we'd learned these lessons. And for me, the insight on that arrived on the 10th of April, 2003. 24 hours after that statue of Saddam Hussein came down in Baghdad, and I'm sure all of you saw it on television. I was in the city, and I decided the following morning to go and visit Saddam Hussein's main palace, the one that would eventually become the American embassy. There'd been some rumor that the Americans were about to blow it up. Silly rumor, but I thought I'd want to go and check it out. I was also curious to see it because before the war, no foreigner, in fact, most Iraqis were not even allowed to approach that palace. I remember driving past it with my Iraqi driver, and I pointed to it and said, "What is that?" And he said, "Don't point and don't look the other way. Nobody's allowed to look." So I thought I'd go and check it out. When I arrived there, I realized that several hundred Iraqis had also arrived for the same reason, the curiosity to see how the tyrant, how their dictator had lived. And inside the palace was a small group of American soldiers. I think they were from the 82nd Airborne. And they were going through all the offices and rooms of the palace, collecting documents and files. The crowd was outside in front in the lawn, and they were a very friendly crowd. Every time an American soldier came out with a box, the crowd would cheer. It was a good atmosphere. And I went inside and to Saddam Hussein's personal office. And there was a giant desk, and on both sides on the wall, 2 Iraqi flags. I don't know if you're familiar with it. A black band, a white band, a red band, and in the middle, Arabic lettering. And while I was in the room, one of the soldiers, I think he was a sergeant, turned to his translator, a young Kurdish man, and said, "What does it say in the middle of the flag?" And the translator said, "It says Saddam Hussein." This was a lie. It does not say Saddam Hussein. It says Allahu Akbar, God is great. And I to this day, I'm not sure why the translator lied. But the sergeant was inspired by this and grabbed hold of the flag and walked out of the room. And I followed out of curiosity. He went to the front porch of the palace and held the flag up. And all the crowd that was gathered outside cheered and came forward towards him. And then he reaches into his pocket and pulls out a Zippo and fires it up. And he's holding the flag up, and he's about to set it ablaze. Fortunately, I was close enough. I grabbed his hand and said, "What are you doing?" And he says, "Well, it says Saddam Hussein. I think they'll get a kick out of seeing us burn him." He said something like, "We're going to fry Saddam's ass." And the crowd, when they saw the lighter come up, sort of fell back in horror, which then gradually turned into anger. And I explained to the sergeant that it didn't say Saddam Hussein, it said Allahu Akbar, and that if he set it on fire, he would be setting off a riot right here and now. And he said, "Oh, I didn't know that." And he sort of quickly put the flag in my hands and said, "Well, you explain that to them," and ran into the palace. So now I'm standing here with a flag in my hand and an angry mob moving towards me. Fortunately, my translator had a very loud voice, and he calmed everyone down. He explained that it was a mistake. When he said the translator was Kurdish, everyone said, "Oh, of course." And then I saw an elderly gentleman wearing the vestments of a tribal chief, and I said, "I think you should have this flag. This came from Saddam Hussein's office. It's not Saddam's flag, it's Iraq's flag. It's your flag. You should have it." And he took it, and they had a little discussion, and then he came back to me and said, "You save the flag, you keep it." And so that's how I have one of Saddam Hussein's flags in my possession. But the fact that the sergeant didn't know what the Iraqi flag said was quite an eye-opener for me. And over the next few weeks, months, there were dozens of times when I saw this sort of lack of knowledge about the country that they had essentially conquered, the culture in which they found themselves. And sometimes the result of this lack of knowledge was benign, and then sometimes it was quite destructive, and people were put in harm's way because they didn't understand what they were doing. And I'm afraid to say that this ignorance lasted a very, very long time, way longer than it should have. It lasted for, by my reckoning, 3 years, I beg your pardon. It wasn't until the late fall of 2006, when the surge began, that attitudes began to change. And the reason for this long period is essentially because American soldiers were not really exposed to ordinary Iraqis or to any Iraqis. They stayed in their bases, they came out patrolling. While on patrol, they were suspicious of their surroundings and of people they encountered. They were under a lot of stress, and that stress often expressed itself in hostility. The few Iraqis that they actually encountered were back in the base, were people who were working as cleaners or interpreters. And the interaction between American and Iraqi was that of, we tell you what to do, and you do it. And there was very little effort to actually communicate. This changed when the surge happened, and people now look back at the surge and point to many reasons why it succeeded. 30,000 additional soldiers, the fact that the US military began to pay Sunni insurgents to stop shooting at them, and any number of other reasons. But for me, I think the crucial thing that happened with the surge was that the Americans finally began to talk to Iraqis and listen and pay attention to them. There was a tribal sheikh I knew in Anbar province, outside of Fallujah. And he and I have known each other for a very long time. And he would receive visits every year from a new American colonel who was in charge of the forward operating base very close to his tribal sort of tent in the desert. And every time an American colonel would come, he would arrive with a translator, and he would tell the tribal sheikh what the Americans wanted from him. This is what we want your community to do. You should stop supporting Al-Qaeda. You should encourage your young men to join the Iraqi security forces. You should do this and you should do that. But when the surge happened, he told me that for the first time he had a colonel who came to him and said, "Tell me what you need." And then at the end of every meeting he had with the colonel would say to him, "Okay, these are 3 things that I'm taking back from the meetings that I need to act upon. These are the ways we're going to act on this information, and you will see the result in a given time frame. And if you don't, when I come back to you next, I want you to remind me that we haven't achieved this." And it sounds so simple and so obvious, but the obvious has a way of, people lose sight of the obvious. We do this in our daily lives, but we do this much more when we are thrust into dangerous, difficult, stressful situations. And unfortunately, the obvious sometimes disappears in the fog of war. When I thought about the lessons that we've learned from the Iraqi war, I thought I'd divide this lecture into 3 sections. What we've learned about our enemy, what the enemy has learned about us, and then what we've learned about ourselves. Now, I'll ask your indulgence on this. I am not yet an American citizen. I hope someday to be, but I'll use the words we and us if you grant me the permission to be an honorary American today, just because it's more convenient and easy than constantly having to say the United States. So what have we learned about the enemy? Well, first thing we learned is that there's not one enemy. There are many, many different groups. We went into Iraq thinking we were fighting Saddam Hussein. We went to Afghanistan thinking we were fighting the Taliban, and then we discovered that there were many other actors at play. Some were visible and some not. In Iraq, we discovered that there was a Sunni insurgency, which was in one part a religious Sunni insurgency and another part a secular one. We realized that there was a Shiite militia. In fact, there were 2 different Shiite militias. Then there was Al-Qaeda. And then, less obviously, there was the Iranians, who were agents provocateurs, but also sometimes directly involved in the fighting. And there were Syrians in the north who were again, enabling a passage for Al-Qaeda, but sometimes also coming across themselves to do mischief. In Afghanistan, too, we've discovered that there are many, many different actors there, non-state actors like Pakistan and Iran, again. So the enemy is not one enemy, and fighting them requires many different strategies. And an American general once told me that it was like taking a football team, no, let me get this right. It was like taking a basketball team and an ice hockey team and putting them in Madison Square Garden against a football team. And eventually, he said, he must have been a football fan, he said, eventually the football team will beat the daylights out of everybody. But if you're watching this fight, it's very hard to follow what's going on because there's so many different things taking place and so many different rules that are being applied and broken all the time. And that's what it was like in Iraq. It was like that covering Iraq too, because we had to, every time I went out to a meeting, I'd have to remind myself who it was that I was meeting and what group or what interest they represented. And it was not always clear from the way they spoke, or certainly it was not clear from the way they looked or the language they used. The other lesson we've learned is that the enemy will not face us in open combat. Every time American arms and American armor present themselves in the battlefield, the enemy is not going to stand around and fight, certainly not for very long. They may use suicide bombers, but they're not suicidal. They know that they can't face down the American military. They know that they're outclassed in every way. And they have no interest in standing around for political reasons and giving us the pleasure of pulverizing them. So we will win any open battle very, very quickly. But that doesn't mean, as we've discovered, that is not mission accomplished. That is just the end of the phase one of operations, and then we go into phase two. And what we've learned about phase two is that the enemy is much better at it than we are. They know the geography, they know the ethnography, they know the culture. They don't wear uniforms. They are able to blend into populations much better than we are. And they will take advantage of all these things to fight us. And they don't understand the concept of losing. There was a bad Hollywood movie about Romans and Roman generals a long time ago, and at one point during the movie, faced with an uprising, one general turns to the other and says, people should know when they've been defeated. But people don't. And certainly these people don't. And they don't regard victory and defeat by the same metrics that we do. In some ways, they understand us better than we understand them. They understand our vulnerabilities. They know how far we're willing to go and where we are not willing to go, in terms of the kinds of violence we are prepared to use, in terms of the limitations of the collateral damage that we are willing to tolerate for our own actions. And they will use low-tech, or just plain low, to fight our high-tech and high ideals. So the most effective forms of IEDs, roadside bombs, were set off with washing machine timers and with cell phones. And we were spending billions and billions of dollars to try and overcome these technologies. I remember I interviewed a young man who was creating triggers for IEDs for the insurgency, and he was doing this freelance for several different insurgent groups. He was an engineer who one day who dreamt one day of going to MIT. And it tickled him pink that the American military was paying the MIT millions of dollars to try and overcome some of these things that he was creating to kill Americans. And he was very proud of the fact that he was able to use an ordinary cell phone to set off IEDs. And he showed me how he did it. And I said, well, I've seen the Americans, they have these very complicated jamming devices at the front of their Humvees that are meant to block out cell phone signals. He said, he opens a box and brings out this thing that looks like a VCR standing on its side. It has some Japanese lettering, Korean lettering on it, actually. And he says, this is what the Americans use. and I'll demonstrate. He says, take out your cell phones, and all of us in the room took out our cell phones, and he says, so he pressed a button, that device came on, and he said, try to make a call. And none of us was able to make a call. That was the jammer. All the phones in the room were jammed. And then he took out his own cell phone and says, watch me. And he made cell phone calls. He was able to send SMS messages. And I said, where'd you get that? And he said, well, an insurgent group brought it in, and they paid me to create ways around this black box. And I said, well, how much are they paying you for it? He said, maybe $50. And I'm not sure I'm going to get that money. They promised me $50. So low tech against high tech, and of course, low tactics against the use of suicide bombers in Iraq, in Afghanistan became sort of the default position or the default weapon of choice for many insurgent groups. And I remember talking to several different insurgent commanders, and more than once I was told that a suicide bomber, from their point of view, was the equivalent of a cruise missile. And I was told, well, you send missiles into you think you can send a missile into my home and kill me while I sleep, but I can do the same with this guy. And I don't have to pay him millions of dollars. He's willing to do it for free. And of course, the use of women, the use of children as unsuspecting suicide bombers. I did a story about this. At one point when all of Baghdad was ringed with blast walls and checkpoints, Al-Qaeda came up with an interesting way of getting past them. They would kidnap an ordinary citizen, preferably a mid-ranking official in the Iraqi government, or low-ranking officials. Someone who had papers that would allow him to go through checkpoints. And they would bring him into a house, and they would pretend to be Shiite militias, and they'd say, we've heard that you're collaborating with the Americans, and there's going to be a reckoning. And he would say, no, I'm a government official, I'm a Shiite myself, and they'd say, no, we don't believe you, and there'd be a long argument discussion. Meanwhile, somebody outside would be planting a bomb in this man's car. And then at some point they would say, okay, we made a mistake. We didn't realize that you were friendly and that we made a mistake. You can leave now. And he'd get back in his car and he'd drive past the checkpoints because he had the ID. And somebody would be following him in a car that didn't have any explosives. And when he got to the place where either it was predetermined or just a place where there happened to be lots of, let's say, policemen or soldiers or ordinary civilians, the person in the following car would use the cell phone to blow up the car. And the next day, sometimes it would be reported that a suicide bomber had driven into a market or a crowded place and killed a lot of people, but he had no idea he was doing this. It was not a suicide bomber, it was just a patsy of the worst kind. So they're willing to do things like that. And it is very hard to protect yourself against people who will go that low. And they realize, this is the other thing we've learned about our enemies, that they don't need to kill us to win. They just need to kill people. And that's enough. They came to that realization after the second Battle of Fallujah in 2005, when they realized that Americans are going to become harder and harder to kill as they became better and better aware of insurgent tactics. So they figured, well, why are we wasting our time and energy trying to kill these Americans in their highly fortified camps? We can just go out into a market in Baghdad, we can go to a school, we can go to the university and kill people there. It'll still reflect badly on the Americans. And they developed, particularly Al-Qaeda, developed a whole ideology around this idea of killing people. I remember interviewing a guy who was training to be a suicide bomber, and I asked him, how do you justify killing innocent people? And his response was that, well, if they're really innocent, they'll go to paradise. And when they go to paradise, they'll be so happy to go to paradise that they'll thank me for it. Because they didn't have to live this long life and suffer suffer a long life in a place like Iraq. They were getting a shortcut, a ticket to paradise because of me. And if they were not innocent, well, then they deserve to die And they took it very seriously. They created this ideology just for this purpose. And they were able to, and still are able to, persuade lots of stupid young men, mostly men, to believe this. So these are some of the things that we've learned about the enemy. And what has the enemy learned about us? They've learned that we can fight a long fight. The Afghan war is in its ninth year. The Iraq war is in its 8th year soon. And a lot of Iraqis and Afghans didn't think we would fight that long. Any number of Iraqis in the summer of 2003, people who were joining the insurgency in large droves at that time, said, the Americans are going to be around for a year or so, they don't have the stomach for a long fight. And they pointed to Somalia, where a few casualties persuaded the Clinton administration to pull American soldiers out. They pointed to the first Gulf War. They said, well, they could have overthrown Saddam Hussein, but they chose not to fight because they didn't want to fight anymore. That was their interpretation of American actions. And so they were absolutely confident that they could outlast American firepower. And I think by 2005, 2006, many of them were saying to me, well, they're still here, and frankly, we didn't think they'd be here that long. I think they misinterpreted when they watched, whether it was in Al Jazeera or in CNN, when they saw anti-war demonstrations in London and in Washington. They assumed that these demonstrations were similar to the ones from Berkeley and Washington during the final phases of the Vietnam War, and they thought it would have the same effect, that it would persuade American politicians to give up. But they didn't realize the subtleties of the anti-war movement. They didn't realize that there was not a draft in the United States, and so this pressure that was being brought didn't really directly impact the military. They didn't understand that most Americans who didn't have a son or daughter in the fight were not following the conflict as closely as they were. Ordinary Iraqis, even those who are non-combatants, I'd come back from a trip to the US and friends of mine, Iraqis, would say, so how's the war playing out there? And I'd say, it's not playing at all. I watch the news and it's not on the news. I meet people in social settings and they don't want to know about what's going on. And this was astonishment for most Iraqis. They just couldn't understand because, of course, that's all they thought about. They've also learned that we're willing to fight hard. This was the other thing that when the Americans first arrived in Iraq, many who were in the insurgency said, they're so fat. In part, this was because, these are soldiers carrying 60 pounds of body armor. But truth be told, there were some units, particularly the reservists, who didn't quite live up to the Spartan ideal, let me say. And the Iraqis said, these guys can't fight. They're fat and they're constantly eating. They're talking about the power bars. There's no way that these people can stand up to fight. We're willing to die. We're willing to starve for days on end. We don't need power bars. We can beat these people. And I think that was something they learned to considerable cost, was a mistake. And eventually, after the second Fallujah war, a lot of people were telling me quite grudgingly that, those Marines, they're tough guys. They can sort of slug it out. They also learned that we adapt pretty quickly to their tactics. The IEDs, once it became clear that the IEDs were a problem, the United States spent a lot of money and put a lot of effort into counteracting them. And sometimes it worked. Sometimes, as I explained with those phone jammers, they didn't. But we were at least able to adapt our tactics and our strategies. And if you look at the chart of American casualties in the Iraq War, you'll find that starting in the summer of 2005, the numbers went way down. And that was not just because there was no direct combat, but that was because the Americans got better and better at spotting the IEDs, driving around them if they didn't have ways of eliminating the risk. And that's significant. Modern armies are not good at adapting quickly to circumstances. It's sort of sobering to realize that we went through the entire First World War and didn't figure out a way to overcome barbed wire. or trenches. We went through most of the Vietnam War and didn't learn how to fight in jungles. But pretty quickly we learned how to fight in Iraq. We learned how to fight in deserts. We learned how to deal with sniper fire. We learned how to overcome the tactics of enemies who were willing to shoot at us from civilian, using human shields. And we learned how to deal with IEDs. But they've also learned that while we are willing to fight the long fight, we are impatient about some things. We need to feel that we are winning. And when we get the sense that we are not winning, that creates problems. And the way that they were able to communicate to the American public, to the Western public, that our forces were not winning the war was by killing ordinary civilians. That was the tactic. They figured that if we kill lots of civilians, this will make headlines back in the US. And maybe Americans don't care if 50 Iraqis die, but if 50 Iraqis die every day, then they'll begin to care. And they were right. The other thing they discovered about us, and this is something that I worry will come back to haunt us in future, is that eventually we will pay them to stop shooting at us. And this is a lesson that was learnt in Iraq, and I fear that the Taliban has taken that to heart in Afghanistan. Our strategy in Iraq, the surge, depended quite heavily on buying off, as I said earlier, the Sunni insurgency. They were willing to be bought off, that's a different matter, but we paid $300 a day per insurgent to stop shooting at American soldiers, even though they had blood on their hands, American blood. And that sends off a lesson to all who might one day come into war with us. It tells them that if they fight long enough, hard enough, and dirty enough, we will eventually give them money to go away. What have we learned about ourselves? We've learned that we have amazingly good soldiers, but terrible diplomats. American soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan have done heroic work, and I'm not just talking about work in the, not just the work of old-fashioned soldiering, killing and securing, but the modern American soldier is required to be a diplomat, a tribal mediator, an urban planner, an expert on building roads and sanitation systems, even a banker. Just a couple of weeks ago, I spoke to a general who'd returned from Afghanistan, and he was saying how his men were disbursing micro loans among Afghans, helping them set up small businesses. And I said, how do you know to do this? He said, well, we learn. And I said, but why are you doing this? Surely this is the work of the State Department. And he rolled his eyes. And I've seen American diplomats in Iraq in the aftermath of the war. I'm sorry to say these were not the A team, or the B, C, or D team even. Most of them there were two classes of people. There was a small group of hardcore believers, people who bought into, they were usually political appointees, who bought into the neocon idea of reforming the Middle East. And they did enormous damage because they brought their ideology with them and tried to impose it on a culture and society that it was not suited for. And then there were these other professional bureaucrats who had no idea and no interest in finding out about the country. The thing I said earlier about the lack of communications, the people who lived in the green zone, the bureaucrats, actually lived among Iraqis. There were many Iraqi families who lived in the green, thousands of them, who lived in the green zone. But they were not allowed to come anywhere near the Americans. They were not allowed to use the same streets. They were not allowed to use the same restaurants, the same clubs. Instead, the Americans sort of built a little piece of America where they could sort of seal themselves out, even within the green zone, a smaller compound where there was a Burger King and where you could buy frappuccinos. And there was absolutely no interest in stepping out of that little cocoon and talking to ordinary Iraqis. And when I'd go to the green zone, I'd meet ordinary Iraqis and I'd say, well, you're on a good wicket here, you're at least in a protected part of Baghdad, and you get to interact with Americans. And they'd say, not really, yes, we are safe, but we don't meet the Americans. And when they pass us in the street in their long convoys, they force us to pull over. Sometimes they bang against my car or sort of essentially the ugly American stereotype. And that contributed so much to all the wrong decisions that were taken after the war. Things needn't have come to where they are today, or where they were in the summer of 2006 when the worst of the insurgency was taking place. I remember the Shiite and Sunni civil war had started out, and I would go to the Green Zone and meet American bureaucrats and diplomats, and I would spend inordinate amounts of my time explaining to them what a Shiite was and what a Sunni was. They had no idea. And sometimes the same person, I'd interview him one week, go back the next week, and I'd ask him questions, and he said, could you switch your tape recorder off for a while and explain that whole Shia-Sunni thing to me again? Read a book. This was one of the most disheartening things that I ever saw. I covered the very tragic slaughter of innocent Iraqis by American soldiers in Iraq, and these were few incidents and far in between, and it got a lot of attention in this country. But I regret now, looking back, that I wasn't able to do a better job of writing about the utter lack of interest that the American bureaucrats in the Green Zone brought to their jobs. I think they did much more harm to the American cause in Iraq than any soldier killing an innocent civilian. We've learned that we don't know the Middle East very well. We don't know Afghanistan and Pakistan very well. We certainly don't understand Al-Qaeda. We're getting better at it all the time, but we're paying a very, very high cost for that. We've also learned that we rely too much on technology and not enough on interaction with people. I've explained that. It took us too long to talk to ordinary Iraqis, talk to ordinary Afghans. In some cases, we picked the wrong ones, people like Ahmed Chalabi. And then when we made one mistake, we sort of withdrew from the whole idea of interacting with Iraqis, and it took us too long to get back to it. And that brings me to the next point, which is that we're very suspicious of local knowledge. There's a tendency to bring American ideas or Western ideas, Western concepts, and insist that these must be good for every environment, for every culture, and for every individual. And there's a disdain for what seems to be a primitive way of life. The word medieval, if you read a sampling of American reporting on Afghanistan, for instance, I think 8 times out of every 10 stories you'll find the word medieval used. And I'm guilty of that myself. I use it too from time to time. But it speaks to an attitude about Afghanistan that is not constructive at all. And it talks of it's a pejorative word, and it indicates a sense of superiority on our part that prevents us from understanding what these people want from us, what these people want from their own future, and what it'll take to get them to stop shooting at us. Calling them names is certainly not the best way to start. The final thing we've learned, and I think this is painfully obvious, that we're not great at nation building. And we're not great at nation building for all the reasons I've said before. And frankly, I don't think we should beat ourselves up too much about it. Nobody is good at nation building. And I think we would do quite well to stop thinking of that as our duty in the world, to impose structures and ideas and political concepts on people who have perfectly good structures that work for them, political ideas that don't sit well with us but work for them. In most cases, they want some of our ideas, they want some of our concepts, but they don't want to buy it wholesale. They don't want to take the Costco approach here. They're much happier taking what suits them best, and they understand better what suits them best. They understand it much better than we do. So these are some of the lessons. I obviously can't be comprehensive in the time that we have here, but these are some of the lessons that we've learned. What are we going to do with them? Well, in Afghanistan and Iraq right now, as I speak, some of these lessons are being applied Our strategies are getting smarter. If you're following the offensive in Marja this month in Afghanistan, you'll see plenty of evidence that this is a very different kind of combat, a very different kind of offensive. 2 days before the offensive began, General Stanley McChrystal called together a tribal council of 450 tribal elders, scholars, religious men from the province of Helmand, where this conflict was about to begin. And he presented his plans and asked people for their opinion. This is the first time I can think of that an American general has, to use a phrase that they use in marketing, focus grouped a war plan. And it sounds ridiculous, but it's the smartest thing he could have done. He had them buy into the plan just by talking to them about it. I don't think it was, we weren't at the meeting, so we can't really know all the details. I'm sure he took suggestions from them. I'm not sure he changed the plan because the war began 2 days later. But just the fact that he was willing to consult them suggests a change in attitude on our part, and I'm sure goes down very well on their part. The other thing that the American general commanders on the ground did was take, and I'm not making this up, public opinion polls of people in Marja. As the soldiers went in, there were people following them with notepads, asking ordinary Afghans, what do you want? Once the fighting is over, once the Taliban is gone, what are your priorities? Is it electricity? Is it water? Is it drainage? How can we bring good government to you? How do we make your lives significantly better that you don't go back to the Taliban? How do we get you to stop planting poppy, which is the major economic driver of this particular part of Helmand province? I'm not suggesting that this will all turn out very well, but it at least suggests that we are being smarter and more serious about how we conduct ourselves, how we conduct war in these places. So I think as we stay in Iraq, as we begin to draw down Iraq and we stay in Afghanistan, this accumulated knowledge from the past 7 or 8 years will make us smarter and better, will kill fewer Americans and kill fewer civilians, and hopefully eventually bring the Taliban to the peace negotiations of some kind. Will these lessons help us in the next war that we encounter? It's hard to say. I'm not sure. One of the truisms of the military historians say this all the time, that generals are always fighting the last war. All our strategies are based on the lessons we learned today. We try to prepare ourselves for the next conflict. But when the next conflict comes, it is so different from everything that went before that it requires a whole new set of lessons to be learned. And so whether it's in Yemen or in Somalia or in some place, or God forbid, Iran, or some place that we can't even imagine now that the next threat comes from, the lessons we learn today may or may not help us. The best we can hope is to keep an open mind, develop systems within the military, and the military is doing this, that allows us to learn faster, to develop a much sharper learning curve. But there will be new lessons from the next conflict, I'm sure of that. And then maybe you'll have me back to tell you what those lessons are. So that's the end of my speech, but I'm happy to take questions. How do we do this?
When you're asking the questions, you could speak into the microphone, that would be great.
5 years from now, who do you see running Iraq and who do you see running Afghanistan?
I think Iraq is the easier of the two questions to answer. I think Iraq will be run by some very messy coalition government, not just 5 years from now, but 10, maybe 15 and 20 years from now. I think the different ethnic and sectarian groups in Iraq will constantly be bickering and fighting amongst each other. There will be sometimes that violence will become kinetic, but most of the fighting, if we're very lucky, most of the fighting will take place within the political arena. They will be deeply inefficient. They will be very corrupt. They already are. And they will be, from our point of view, since we've spent billions of dollars and shed American blood there, they'll be deeply unsatisfying. They won't be terribly friendly towards us. They might be friendlier towards Iran than they are to us. But I think Iraq has a better chance of making it work than Afghanistan does. Afghanistan is a much difficult question to answer. A hell of a lot depends on what happens these next 2 years before we get to the point where, if President Obama is to be taken at his word, we begin to draw down. To use, again, a marketing MBA jargon, we're at an inflection point in Afghanistan. If we get this right, I suspect in either case, it'll be messy, and it probably behooves us to prepare for that. It'll be messy. We're not going to get Jeffersonian democracy in either of those two countries. We're not going to get American-style governance, if that is a good thing, in those countries.
You covered the three areas rather well. That is what we learned about them, what they learned about us, and what we learned about ourselves. Do we know what they've learned about themselves and getting prepared for their future? Education and so forth.
That's an excellent question. And some people have. And I'd like to think a very large proportion. This is in the realm of I can't find exact statistics for this. But a large proportion of people have looked at themselves more closely than they had before. And our staying there for a long time has helped. The fact that we've stuck around so long has forced them to confront their own situation in a way that they might not have done if we'd left quickly. There is some polling to suggest that across the Muslim world, people have lost. They've sort of lost faith with the extremists. Osama bin Laden is no longer the Robin Hood figure that he was after 9/11. They're beginning to question the notion of suicide bombings. And a big reason for this is that today, the vast majority of people killed by terrorist acts are Muslims, not Westerners. Most of the attacks don't take place out here in the West. It happens in communities where ordinary Muslims live. So they've begun to reassess. It's not the same thing as they're beginning to do something about it, but it's important that they're beginning to reassess. There are some positive signs in Iraq of a small handful of civic leaders. These are not politicians. These are people in the NGO sphere, people who work on women's issues and children's issues, who are able to communicate with Iraqis by bypassing the politicians and beginning to have some success. But this is all very, very nascent. It's far too early to start getting excited about it, and there are many ways that this could still go horribly wrong.
We have a microphone on both sides. So
One more thing I would say. A big part of the problem is that even when this realization dawns, they don't really have the political and social structures to take that realization and act upon it. It's not enough for a society to realize that they need a change of direction. They need a leader to take them to those new directions, and they don't have that. And I've lamented about this 100 times, that Iraq and Afghanistan don't have statesmen. They have politicians, not very good ones, but they don't have statesmen. There's no Nelson Mandela for Iraq. There is no Mahatma Gandhi for Afghanistan. And unfortunately, you can't create these people. They have to come from within those communities.
Yes, you pointed out some big lessons that we learned after we went into Iraq, and they really seemed to be very strong ones. I just wondered if we had known about that before, if we had investigated and seen what we were getting into, that there's a strong likelihood that we wouldn't have gone in at all. Were they that strong, or were we so intent on going? Were we so intent on going in that we, no matter what we saw, we would have gone in?
I think if we had known, 2020 hindsight and everything, but I think if we had understood Iraq better, we wouldn't have gone in there. Afghanistan, we had to go, and I don't think there was a choice there. After 9/11, something had to be done. The Taliban were not willing to give up Al Qaeda, and so I don't think we had a choice there. But in Iraq, I think we would not have gone in.
Yeah.
We would have spent more time focusing on Afghanistan and Al-Qaeda in other places. And I think that might have been a good thing. It wouldn't have been good for my friends in Iraq. I feel very conflicted about this. I was in Iraq as the drums of war were beating in this country. I made friends there. I'd seen how they lived under Saddam Hussein, and I felt sympathy for them. And if I put my hand to my heart, I was hoping that America would go to war against Saddam Hussein, even if it was for false reasons, because I thought that would be the best thing that could happen to my friends. That would give that society an opportunity to shake off. That there was no other way that they could be free from that, from Hussein and his sons. So I feel conflicted about it, but I suspect that we would not have gone to war.
Thank you.
Until 2 or 3 years ago, there was considerable comment about the possibility of partitioning the country into three. That seems to have disappeared from the debate. Given the time that you spent on the ground, was that ever a viable alternative, and did it have support from anyone other than journalists and politicians from the West?
It had some support from the Kurds in the north. And I think if they have their druthers, they would like to have a country of their own. But they also use the threat of that to try and extract political concessions from Baghdad. The Kurds, because they have a longer experience with democracy, they lived under the American shield after the first Gulf War, have a more sophisticated understanding of politics than the Arabs. But yeah, I think in their hearts, Kurds would like a separate country. In their minds, they know they can't have it, and they'll make the best they can of their situation. As far as Shiites and Sunnis are concerned, not a chance. Even during the worst of the sectarian violence, on both sides of that fight, people didn't want to have a separate country. They didn't even want to convert. The Shiites didn't want to convert all the Sunnis into Shiism, and the Sunnis didn't want to convert all the Shiites into the Sunni faith. They wanted political dominance. They wanted power. They wanted influence. They wanted jobs. They wanted money. This was not really a religious fight. Really, the religion was or the sect, your sect was your uniform. It was a way you identified friend from foe. But they wanted dominance over Iraq. They didn't want their own separate country in which they could do as they please. I asked this question thousands of times when I met Shiite militias or Sunni militias, and I said, "What is it that you really want? Would it be all just simpler if we let the south of Iraq become Shiistan and the middle of the country become Sunnistan?" And nobody, not one person in the thousands that I spoke to, expressed any interest in that. There is a strong national identity in Iraq. It's an Arab identity. It's not necessarily a Kurdish identity, but it is a strong one. And I think it'll last for a long time, even as the two communities bicker and argue and sometimes break out into fighting and killing each other. I think the national identity is stronger than that.
If you go back 10 years, Bobby, Iraq was always considered to be one of the more secular of the Middle East countries, with highly developed technologists, engineers, hydrologists, women in education. Then, of course, though we didn't quite know this at the time, the 10 years between the first Gulf War and the second Gulf War, there was a massive exodus of the educated middle class. Do you think that Iraq has any chance of becoming, again, a center of technical, scientific expertise in the Arab world in the way that it was 20 years ago?
There is a chance because most Iraqis look back to that period as a golden period, and they actually want to go back there. One big difference between Iraq and Afghanistan is that when Iraq had its golden period, all boats were rising. In the 1970s, after the oil shock, when money began to come into Iraq from when Iraq freed itself from the contracts it had with the Western oil companies, there was a lot of development, a lot of money was pumped into the system, and yes, the Sunnis got a larger share of the cake, but ordinary Shiites saw their situation improving as well. They got schools, they got roads, their kids had better jobs. So Iraqis look back at that time in a way that Afghans can't. And actually, Iraqis can almost reach out and touch and feel that time in their past when they were, and this is a matter of pride for them, when they were the leading light of the Arab world. The big problem is that the intellectual capital that they'll need to get them there is not in Iraq. You spoke of the first exodus between the two wars of the Iraqi middle class. Then there was the second exodus after 2003 as the violence got worse. Over 1 million Iraqis, and these are all middle class. These are doctors, professors, architects, senior government servants, civil servants, have fled and live as exiles in Jordan and in Syria. And much of that, most of them, maybe 80% of them, are actually Sunnis. Because by definition, since those were the people who had power, those are the people who had access and privilege, they had all the best jobs and best positions in society. The current Iraqi government, being dominated by Shiites, don't have a very strong impulse to bring them back. But after this election, next month, if you get a more secular government, or if you get a government that is at least more broadly representative of the people, some of these Sunnis who live in Jordan and Syria may be persuaded to come back. And if they do, and it's a big if, and if they have a chance to contribute to the new Iraq, another big if, then slowly, messily, I think they can begin to reconstruct. Of course, they have the big advantage of sitting on this huge lake of oil. And so once that money begins to come through, several layers of filtering and corruption, once that money begins to come into the system, and if you have these, the intellectual capital returning at the same time as capital arrives, there is a chance that you create a perfect storm that begins to move the country forward.
I think we have time for one more question. We have one here, one here.
Oh, really quickly. Gretchen Peters just wrote that book, Seed of Terror,
yeah.
and she was saying that the finance, of course, is poppy seed, and that the Bush administration wanted to spread Roundup throughout the country, get all the people out and do that. And she was also saying that, that's one way of cutting them off, cutting off the supply. If we're going to end what's going on there, wouldn't we have to somehow cut off that supply?
One of the best pieces of news I had last year was that the Pentagon had called Gretchen Peters in to come and advise them. I thought that was also indicative of how much smarter we've become about Afghanistan. She's exactly right. I mean, a lot of effort has gone into destroying poppy fields. And the result has been mixed. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. People just go back to growing poppy. The fact is it's the best way to make a living in a country that doesn't have many other options. And if you're a farmer and you're making, I don't have the numbers at the top of my head, but poppy is by a factor of 10 the most lucrative crop that you can possibly grow. And for American soldiers to go in there and say, well, we want you to stop growing poppy and want you to grow apples instead, never made any sense. But you can cut off, you can make poppy cheaper, or rather you can affect the economics of poppy cultivation by going after the network. And it's a criminal network. Yes, Taliban is involved, but it's a kind of network that's not that different, as Gretchen points out in her book. It's not that different from the network in Colombia. And it's run along business lines. And if you have good intelligence, you can tell when the convoys of trucks carrying opium travel out of Afghanistan into Pakistan. You know the routes they take. And there are ways of getting them on the road. And if you destroy enough of those convoys, that'll have a direct bearing on the price of poppy. And it maybe persuade people that maybe growing apples is not such a bad idea. I think there was a question here.
Final question.
You talked about lesson learned, but those were secondary lessons. Did you go back to see what went wrong in the political sense that created these two hard lessons to be learned from? Both of these problems in Iraq and in Afghanistan were created in the United States. From 1963, Saddam Hussein was backed by CIA. In 80s...
In 1963, he wasn't such a bad guy.
Yeah, but
No,
still,
I'm not being facetious. He actually, you know, a lot of Iraqis now, they've had a chance to look at their history. You hear this in Iraq a lot, that he was a fantastic vice president and a terrible president. Because when he was vice president, that was in the 70s, when all that oil money was coming in, and he was spending it on public works.
Yeah, but when in 83, Rumsfeld, when they gave him a green light to use VMD against the Kurdish, and also the Taliban were created with the famous Reagan in the White House that said, these brave men are moral equivalent of our founding fathers. And also, what is the role of Saudi Arabia and Russia in this? You remember in 1983, Brzezinski said, we should be elated that the Russians are in Afghanistan because that is our revenge of Vietnam. If we heard that, Russians have heard that too. What are the roles of these two, and how are they making it more difficult?
I wasn't covering the build-up to the war. I was in Afghanistan, so my knowledge of what was happening in Washington came from the same sources as yours. I read the papers, I read Time magazine, and many smarter journalists than me have written quite extensively about the lead up to the war and all the mistakes that were made. And so, you know, I won't go too deep into that because that's a little out of my field. But I take your point, and I agree that the seeds for a lot of these things were sown many years ago, and that if previous American administrations didn't plant them, they certainly watered them quite heavily. They did them with what they thought were their best interests in mind. Sometimes you don't realize the monster you're creating. The role that the Saudis and the Russians are playing in the current conflict, I haven't seen too much of Russian presence in either of those two countries. I think the Russians, just judging by my Russian friends, are deriving a certain amount of satisfaction at seeing America twist itself into knots, particularly in Afghanistan, because it allows them to say, if not, we told you so, we could have told you so. So they're enjoying some of that. The Saudi role is much more complex. There's now very little doubt that Saudi Arabia funded for a very long time the Taliban, and maybe in some small way continues to do so, if not directly from the state, then from individual contributors. But they have, once it became clear that Osama bin Laden's second goal, if you like, was to topple the Saudi regime, and once suicide bombings and other terrorist attacks began to take place in Saudi Arabia, there was a very clear shift in the Saudi perception and policies. In Iraq, although a number of Saudi citizens initially joined the Al-Qaeda suicide bombing train and traveled to Syria and then came into Iraq and joined Abu Musab Zarqawi, the fact that they had to take this long route to Iraq instead of just crossing over the Saudi-Iraqi border tells you something. It meant that the Saudi authorities had begun to close down these borders. They did a pretty decent job of cutting out a lot of the well-known supply chains of money. They cracked down on these so-called charities that were basically ways of collecting money for both Al-Qaeda and for the Iraqi insurgency. And I understand from my reporting at the CIA, the Saudi intelligence shared a lot of useful information with the CIA that allowed them to prevent many attacks, particularly in Iraq. I think the Saudis get it now, finally. They get it. They realize that this Frankenstein's monster they've created can do Saudi Arabia just as much harm as it does, if not more so than other parts of the world. But getting it is, again, not the same thing as being able to do something about it. They're doing plenty, but maybe you need another another generation of Saudi leaders who can come in with new ideas and begin to challenge some of the problems they have in their society, which is where these problems come from. I'm not sure that is a satisfactory answer, but it is. We have to recognize the realpolitik of Saudi Arabia. They're not going to overnight turn into a liberal, progressive democracy. They're not. But within their own rules, they've gotten better and more responsible. They are, if not a good actor, they're certainly no longer a bad actor in some of these conflicts. And I think that's a huge improvement over where they were in 2001.
I think at this point we need to draw the evening to a close. Sorry, Bharat. Bobby, thank you very much. Before we let Bobby go, I'd like to say that the Jacobson Lecture is a highlight of a spring season which is full of international programs here at Concordia College. I hope that you'll all visit the new show in the Osiris Art Gallery, which is a show of artists from South Asia who live mostly over here now, and I know Bobby enjoyed it, and there are some really unique images in that. There'll be a film on March 11th in the evening connected with that show, and that is on the theme of a contemporary interpretation of the partition of India in 1947. And we are going to have a couple more talks here, evening talks, on April the 8th. Jim Frederick, who has just written a book about Iraq and an atrocity committed there. I think that might have been one that you referred to, Bobby, an atrocity committed by a small platoon of US troops who were fighting in what was then known as the Triangle of Death, and it's an absolutely gripping story, so I hope you'll come and hear him. And before that, on March the 18th, on a US political topic, we have the author John Heilemann coming to talk to us. He has just published a book which shot up to the top of the New York Times bestseller book list called Game Change, about the 2008 election campaign. So please join us for that. Also, if you're not on our mailing list, there's a sign-up sheet outside. Finally, Bobby, thank you.
Thank you.